Welcome to the Saints Among Us class. Today's class is called The Saints Among Us, Why the Church Keeps Names and How a Family Comes to Love 9 of them. I'm here today to introduce you to a few of my family's favorite saints. This will be kind of a way to glimpse into how all of this works in the life of the Orthodox believer and the life of the Orthodox faith. Tonight, I'm going to really introduce you to some of my favorite saints, the saints that have become very special to me and to my wife and kids. We're going to start with the wink. Now, before I met my wife, Paulina, I asked my confessor, how do I find a wife? I was in a situation where I was kind of in the relationship wilderness, so to speak. And as such, I was having a hard time. And my confessor was, listening to me, hearing my struggles. And he didn't so much give me advice as he gave me a saint. He told me to obtain an icon of Saint Xenia of St. Petersburg and to pray to her. And this wasn't because I'm Russian, I'm not. Now, around the same time, my future wife, who I didn't know at the time, Paulina, her confessor also gave her a saint. He gave her the instruction to pray to St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco. And yes, that's San Francisco. Orthodoxy has American saints. He served much of his ministry in California, where I'm from. Now, neither of us knew that the other person had an assignment. We hadn't even met yet, as I mentioned. I eventually met Paulina online through an Orthodox Facebook group, and we eventually met up in person. When we compared notes, we realized we had a very similar parallel story. And then one Sunday when I was visiting her, because this was a long distance relationship, I was standing in her home parish in Phoenix, Arizona, where her family stood every Sunday. And I looked up and something caught my breath. There were two icons on opposite walls facing each other. One was St. Xenia and the other was St. John. See, they had been at this a while, and we simply showed up late. A household can and should be built on purpose. Now, my story, it only makes sense if the saints are alive and if they're actually doing something. So my thesis for the night is this: if saints participate in our lives, then choosing them is a real, meaningful, and important work. It's not new bling. It's not fresh new drip. They are not decorations. Every name in my house was chosen, and there were various occasions, baptisms of us and our children, a reader's tonsure, even the family itself. 9 names today that we're going to cover, a reason behind each, and we'll have a full roster by the end, along with a few extras. I also want to note Hebrews 12:1 talks about the idea of us being compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. In other words, we're surrounded. We're going to come back to this at least twice. Speaking of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, it contains what many like to call the Faith Hall of Fame. It lists a whole bunch of people who are held up as people who exemplify something worth imitating. Now, that doesn't mean in all of their parts that they are holy and without blame. Many of these Faith Hall of Famers are nonetheless deeply flawed. So we have Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, David, Samuel, the prophets. We've got a whole bunch. And then in 1138, it says of them, of whom the world was not worthy. A whole chapter naming what we might imagine are dead people. But the theology says that they are not dead. They are alive in Christ. And this is how they can be witnesses. Hebrews 12, verse 1 turns a list of faithful Bible heroes into encouragers for us. So when we say we're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, we are talking in the present tense. We're talking about now. We're talking about something they actually help us with. So I want you to let that settle in. Of whom the world was not worthy, and compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. And Wisdom of Sirach, this is like one of my favorite Old Testament books. It's in the Orthodox Bible. It is also in Catholic Bibles as Ecclesiasticus. It is omitted from the majority of Protestant Bibles that are published today, but it is nonetheless a very valuable book. Sirach's in our Bible. pick up an Orthodox study Bible if this book is not in your Bible. Wisdom of Sirach was already doing what Hebrews did generations before. Sirach 44:1 says, "Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us." And then he goes on to run his own Hall of Fame, Faith Hall of Fame, for 6 whole chapters. 44 verse 14 says, "Their name lives to all generations." See, this is the kind of testimony that is the same instinct that the Orthodox Church has when we hold feast days. And it was defined 2 centuries before the church even existed. So you can kind of think of Hebrews 11 as essentially Sirach 44 and following in light of the resurrection. Now, the names are alive, and we know it. So what does this look like on an ordinary day? Well, 4 things are very important to us for the saints. That's intercession, imitation, feast days, and name days, a person's name. So let's talk about that. Intercession. This is like leaning over in the pew and asking for prayers. It's the same act. The difference is that death didn't cancel the membership of a saint in the church. Okay, so when we're asking for the intercessions of the saints, we are going to them and asking them for their prayers. And what they can offer us that I cannot offer you and other flesh and blood human beings in this fallen world cannot offer is this: concentrated, focused prayer, free from the distractions of sin and in the presence of the Lord unceasingly. I mean, that's what they have. Unceasing presence before the Lord, and they have been set free from their sins. They are no longer drawn in by that. You know, you ask me to pray for you, I might forget before I even walk out the door. The saints are not like that. The saints do not have those same limitations. Now, rhyming with limitations is imitation, and you read their lives, you take what applies, and you bring it into yours. That's something that we do with the saints. Feast days. This is an important part of imitating them, also of honoring them. We keep their memory on a calendar so that, you know, we don't forget. We honor them. We hold their memory forth within the life of the church. You know, and then finally, most of us were given a saint at baptism. It was chosen by us, or perhaps in conversation with a mentor, a godparent, or a priest. But the bottom line is, with the saints, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. That's what James chapter 5, verse 16 says. And that is what the saints are offering us. When they offer their intercessions, they are righteous people with effectual fervent prayers. So we value them, and we value their role in the church, their ongoing role in the life of the church. So the foundation of this is a deeply biblical idea, though. So what has to be true for any of this to take place? Number one, Psalm 82:1 says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So you have this idea in the Old Testament that God has set up everything. You know, he's the very foundation of being. He did not have to create anything, but he did. Nonetheless, he created all things. And he has chosen to involve his creatures in his saving acts and in his work. And as such, he has set up a divine council. This council has angels. It has elevated and saved human beings. We're going to talk about who all is on this council, but just know this much: the Old Testament sets this up where he is in council. In 1 Kings chapter 22, we see what this looks like a little bit. Micaiah sees the Lord enthroned. He's got hosts of angels on his right and left, and God asks them a question. So we get a glimpse into this throne room. Job chapter 1 and 2, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord. Again, this very much feels like walking into, the king's chambers to speak to him. In Revelation 4-5, this is one of the most majestic visions of heaven, with a throne, 24 elders. There's these strange living creatures. There's 10,000 times 10,000 angels. I mean, the place is just packed. The council is huge. Bottom line is, heaven has kind of a standing picture. There's a throne with a court around it. If you want to learn more about this, I do recommend you check out the podcast Lord of Spirits, or the book by the same name from Father Stephen DeYoung and Father Andrew Stephen Damick, both of which are available through Ancient Faith Ministries. But they will unpack that in much greater depth. But that is kind of what is like the backstory to having saints, is that God has invited his creatures, whether they are elevated human beings or whether they are holy angels, he's invited them to participate with him in his divine council. Next, people ask, well, I object. Isn't this just mythology? You know, it's a fair question, I think, considered from a certain standpoint, and there's a couple answers. For one thing, there's a thread that really never breaks. You know, I traced a variety of texts for you, Psalms through a variety of books during the Second Temple Judaistic period, all the way up until it enters the Apostles' own vocabulary. And that brings me to number 2, which is Paul actually argues from it. So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3, he says, "Do you not know that we shall judge angels?" He's like mid-argument, he drops this in as if everybody would share this premise. Nobody argues from a premise that the audience is going to find absurd. You're using the premise to establish common ground so that you can persuade them to see it your way. The apostle was not copying the pagans. He was writing about this stuff honestly from within the Jewish household. So this is also a good time, speaking of Father Stephen DeYoung, this is a good time for me to plug his book, Religion of the Apostles, which does a really good job of situating first century Christianity in its place during the Second Temple Judaism period, and also showing essentially how Orthodox Christianity is the rightful heir of that early Christian teaching. So how do we get from the courtroom to the communion? Council was never angels only. Revelation puts human elders on the throne. And that is how we eventually get to the communion of saints. Hebrews chapter 12 says, "To an innumerable company of angels and to the spirits of just men made perfect." Same sentence, same room, boom. We've got them together. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can approach the lives of the saints. One is from a purely biographical standpoint, historical standpoint. This is like, this is where a documentarian would come in. It's here that scholarship matters. You know, seeing saints as historical figures and putting them in their time and place is certainly an important act. But there's also another aspect of understanding the saint, and that's the hagiography. Hagiography is a type of biography that is saint-focused. These are saint stories. This is a way of introducing you to someone alive. Hagios, this is the Greek term for saint. It's got its own genre. It's frequently will contain fantastical tales, miracle stories. So biography is meant to inform and is judged on accuracy, whereas hagiography similarly informs, but it's meant to introduce someone who's alive. It's someone that you're going to recognize upon seeing them. Now, we do tend in the modern era to be very rationalist. We often dismiss miracle stories. You know, we might get some details right and then end up missing the question the text was actually asking because we are so busy being rationalists and not focusing on what truly is coming forth in the miraculous. When we read a saint's life, we should not be reading with a skeptical spirit. We should be reading a saint's life like receiving a letter about a relative that we're about to go pick up from the airport that we haven't met before. We're getting to know them. We're not fact checking as much as we're trying to see what's here that I need to know and what will I recognize when I see them. So while I am certain that many saint stories do have later embellishments, the Orthodox Church absolutely does believe in the miraculous. And we believe that like what makes miracles so special is that they are indeed a unique intervention by God into our ordinary lives. So we don't simply dismiss the saint tales just because they contain wild things. I mean, we follow the Bible. So we know that wild things are a testimony to God's actions in the world. So let's go back to the Council of Nicaea so that I can cover my first three of the 9 saints. Nicaea was in AD 325. 318 followers were present. And they were there because Constantine had not long earlier, had 12 or 13 years earlier, had made Christianity legal, and suddenly people could talk openly about their faith. And this actually led to the uncovering of quite a bit of heresy and controversy among the Christians. And so Constantine was like, hey, you Christians need to get it together. This is not good for the life of my empire to have so much controversy. I want you guys to sort this out, figure it out. And so he did. He called the council, and there are 3 names that run through that room in a defining way. First is Saint Athanasius. He was a deacon. He was about 27 years old when the council happened. He had no vote, but he was perhaps the single most influential saint at the council, at least in hindsight. And he was secretary to Alexander. He was my patron at baptism. And he became my patron at baptism because I loved him even as a Protestant Christian. I thought he was an incredible historical figure, and he was very meaningful to me. And so when I had the opportunity, I was overjoyed to take his name in baptism. St. James of Nisibis, he was also in the room at Nicaea. He was actually a bishop. He was a signer. He was one of the 318 bishops that were there. One of the most notable things of him was that he was a teacher of the great Saint Ephrem the Syrian. And then his cousin, who he was actually raised with, Gregory the Illuminator, was also represented there. He was not present. He was too old. He was actually in seclusion. But he sent his son, Aristarchus, with the decrees. Gregory the Illuminator is my son's patron saint. Now, Gregory and James were first cousins. The traditional Armenian account has James's mother as Gregory's paternal aunt, so his father's sister. The 2 boys were raised and educated together at Caesarea for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And years later, Gregory wrote asking his cousin to write some homilies on faith and love. And those homilies ended up having an outsized impact historically on other people. So we've got 2 cousins and we've got a deacon with no vote. But we have one creed and one faith that ties them all together. So let's talk about Holy Athanasius the Great. And I want to take a second to point out what saint means. Saint means holy. Sanctus is Latin and Hagios is the Greek. It's people who are not of this world, people who are different than that which comes from this earth, right? This is what holiness is getting at. It's something that is set apart in a way different way. So Athanasius the Great, Holy Athanasius, Saint Athanasius, he walks into the council essentially as support staff. And he leaves having supplied the most important word, homoousios, which is where we get the idea of one essence with the Father. Now, to be fair to Arius, if that's possible, he was by a lot of accounts, fairly reasonable. He was popular, but he was a beloved pastor. You might even call him a 4th century influencer. He put his theology to music, and the result was that Athanasius spent the next 45 years arguing with bad theology set to a catchy song. Athanasius was exiled multiple times. About 17 of 45 years as a bishop was spent away from Alexandria in those 5 exiles. They came to call him Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. It was not some tough guy compliment, although it's kind of become that. Instead, it was more about an accurate head count. I mean, he was against the world. And he was willing to lose everything over the claim that Christ became man that we might be made God. He was just incredible. 5 times exiled. There was a time when the entire Eastern Episcopate, all the bishops, had pretty much apostatized and gone Arian. Athanasius Against the World was talking about basic arithmetic. He outlasted the emperors who banished him. And there were plural emperors who banished him, more than one. Like, there was a stretch where, like I said, basically the whole church had fallen away. And so I'm sure he drew comfort from the scriptures when he read Paul writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:7. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Undoubtedly, Athanasius felt a little bit like that. Now, in his own words, he said he was incarnate, or he was made man, that we might be made God. If Christ is a creature, the problem with this claim is that it's blasphemy. And Athanasius would be right to be deposed. If Christ is God, though, then what he's saying is the gospel. And there's nothing more to add. So why the creed we say at liturgy says of one essence with the Father is because a deacon with no vote would not let it go. Next is Holy James of Nispus, also called Jacob of Nispus. Nispus was out on the Persian frontier. It's modern day Turkey. He contested this. It was contested ground his entire life. He spent many years as a hermit and ascetic. He kind of reminds me a little bit of John the Baptist. He lived in caves. He ate a lot of wild plants. He had a coarse goat hair cloak. And he was not preparing to be a bishop. At least he didn't think he was. But the city drew him out to make him a bishop. He founded the church and the school at Nispus. Like I said earlier, he taught St. Ephrem the Syrian. At Nicaea, he was one of the signers, and he was the first cousin of Gregory. Now, I include him because this is what I am called now in the church. And I mention this as kind of an interesting aside because typically you're going to get one patron saint. I did learn, though, that sometimes when people are made clergy, such as a priest, or perhaps even made into a monk, they might take another name. And that name would replace the previous sacramental name that they had been called. So, I have a priest friend who's now a Father George, but I knew him as Marshall before he was a priest. In the same way, I was Athanasius at my baptism, and when the bishop made me a reader, I asked my priest, would it be possible to change my name back to a variation of Jamey? And that is how I picked Holy James of Nispus, was that I had the opportunity to have my name changed. And part of the reason this was important is because of the advice that I give our catechumens. I pretty frequently encourage people, especially those with a Christian name, like if your name is Luke, you already have a great patron saint, Luke the evangelist, right? So it might make sense to keep Luke and not take Barsanuvius. That's my thinking, right? Now, at the end of the day, it's whatever the priest blesses. So if the priest blesses you to be called Holy Goofbird, the Great, whatever, that's what you're going to be called. But at the end of the day, it's his blessing and what the bishop has blessed the priest to do. So I chose this name on purpose for two reasons. One, to reclaim my given name. And number two, I liked having a connection to my son's patron, Gregory. So let's talk a little bit more about what went on at that time. Let's take you back to 338. Shapur II of Persia, he brings an army to Nispus, and they just lay siege to the city. In the traditional account, James is praying from the city walls, and as a result of his prayers, gnats and mosquitoes end up overrunning the Persian camp. Elephants and horses begin to stampede. The army withdraws, the city holds, and everybody credits James and his prayers. The miracle belongs to the traditional account. The siege belongs to the historical record. Both of them, though, are really part of the conversation, in my opinion. I don't think you want to have one or the other. And maybe it's both and. Maybe the historical record tells us the truth, even if the historical record has no opinion on whether or not his prayers were the driving force. His life reminds me much of a text I read earlier, and I'll read a little bit more of it. Hebrews 11:38, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So, what did he ask his cousin for? Well, Gregory the Illuminator wrote to his cousin James asking him to write some homilies or sermons on faith and love. As a result, we have a book called The Demonstrations that for something like 1,000 years was attributed to St. James and passed around. Now, we know that Gregory the Illuminator did write to him and asking him to write these homilies. What we don't know is what ever happened to those homilies he wrote. And part of that is because the demonstrations are probably from a guy named Aphrahat, the Persian sage. Aphrahat, when he was baptized, took the name Jacob, or James, at his baptism. And that is how the books got mixed up. Now, it isn't also entirely possible that Aphrahat the Persian had collected some of the writings from James from an earlier generation, loved him, collected them, maybe even embellished them, added to them. I'm not really sure. But nonetheless, we have a book that's under James's name that may have been written by someone else, but nonetheless remains very influential and faithful to the teaching of James of Nisibis. We have a similar story, actually, with Holy Gregory the Illuminator. I will get to the part about the book in just a minute, but let's talk about him. His father, Anak, assassinated the king of Armenia. Turns out this is not something that kings are very appreciative of. A king's court is going to be turned upside down if the king dies, and if they have any coherence, they're going to come after you. His family was basically completely destroyed in reprisal. So infant Gregory was carried off to Caesarea to be saved, and he was raised a Christian with his cousin James of Nisibis. Grown, he returns. He returns to serve the king, a new king, of course, King Tradat, the son of the man his father killed. At some point, he gets ordered to sacrifice to a false god, and he refuses. And as a result, they throw him into a pit and leave him to die. I told my son a couple years ago, trying to just, inspire him by his patron saint. I was telling him that St. Gregory was thrown into a pit, and my son was a little bit confused, and he thought it sounded fun. And so I thought I better clarify, what do you mean fun? And he said, well, was it a ball pit? Because there's only one kind of pit my son knows, and that's the indoor playgrounds with the ball pit that kids can jump into. It was not that kind of fun. He was there for 13 years. God watched over him, and he sent a widow who baked bread to lower it over the edge so that he could be sustained. God and a widow bringing him bread. He's my son's patron. He was a saint for anyone who has been written off but still holding out. And in God's providence, my son was born on my mother's birthday. She prayed for it, and he arrived 2 weeks early. So we didn't expect my mother's prayers to be answered in the affirmative, but indeed he was born on her birthday. And coincidentally enough, Gregory's other mother, grandmother, I should say, is Nadija, or Hope, and her patron saint is Hope from the four-saint trio, Sophia, Faith, Hope, and Love, who we will talk about in a little bit. And Gregory was born on the feast day of his grandmother. The thing is, we're born into community. And that's one of the things the saints teach us. I will return to that later. One of the communities, though, that was created from the saints we've been talking about, and specifically from Gregory the Illuminator, is the first Christian nation. The king went mad. He went insane. His sister dreamt that only the man in the pit could heal the king. So they have this man who's been there for 13 years, hauled up, alive, and he heals the king. The king is so blown away by this. He baptizes, he agrees to be baptized, and so he's baptized along with his court in the Euphrates River. Armenia then becomes the first nation to adopt Christianity as the state religion. The traditional year for this is 301. I want you to think about that. 301 was a full 12 years before Christianity was legalized in the Roman world via the Edict of Milan. So did you catch that, though? Christian before Christianity was legal in Rome. And that came out of a hole in the ground. Thanks to his steadfast faithfulness, he converted the king and then the nation. They did not call him the illuminator by accident. Acts 13:47 says, I have set thee to be a light to the Gentiles, that thou shouldst be for salvation unto the ends of the earth. The saints had fulfilled that. After Nicaea, Gregory the Illuminator withdrew. He died in seclusion in a cave. He was buried by shepherds who didn't even know who he was. And yet the pit he was in for 13 years is now a holy chapel. Boy, are there saints among us. So there's a book called The Teaching of St. Gregory. I've got a copy. It's an early Armenian catechism, basically teaching the basics of Christianity from within the Armenian church. It's been their confession for years. The text goes back to about the 5th century. And while it is attributed to St. Gregory, it was, again, most likely written down by another author later. Now, it's not surprising to me, though, that his own writings don't survive. A lot of fathers just simply didn't have much survive. They were holy men or holy women, and they were not widespread availability of their writings. And so they didn't survive in written form. But nonetheless, people loved him. People appreciated him. People wanted to keep his memory and his teaching alive. And so it's not surprising that just as it's not surprising that his writings didn't survive, it's also not surprising that his teaching did anyway, though. And it takes really nothing away. So there was a later author who wrote it down, and that is how it came to be attributed to him. I don't think that's a problem, though. I think that's just how these things go sometimes. Even like, for example, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. It's not like these Grimm brothers went and came up with all these stories. They wrote down older stories. They wrote down stories that were passed on to them. And how much more true is that in the Christian church, where we pass on the holy tradition? So next I want to talk about two very special saints. Takes us right back to the beginning, when I was talking about the wink between our two saints. And I want to talk first about the saint that Paulina was sent to, a saint that ministered here in America. He was born Mikhail Maximovich Kharkov. He fled to Serbia after the Russian Revolution. It was said that he barely slept. He served the liturgy basically every day. He could be found late at night up in the bell towers over the city praying. He followed his people all century. Shanghai, the Philippines, Western Europe, San Francisco. He ministered to the Orthodox, and he was known for serving orphans. In fact, when I was baptized at the St. Juvenali Orthodox Mission in Kailua, Kona, Hawaii, I was very blessed to know an elderly Chinese woman who had been one of his orphans. She was brought from Shanghai to the U.S. by this great saint, who she knew since she was an orphan. Now, he reposed on July 2nd, 1966 in Seattle, and he was glorified in 1994. His relics are incorrupt. This is something that happens with some of our saints, where their bodies do not decay even after many years. They're not embalmed, and yet their bodies remain intact. He is now in a reliquary casket in San Francisco, and you can go visit him. Now, my wife and I, we got married during the pandemic, and we were actually going to be married at the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Honolulu, Hawaii. We had a wedding date, we had invitations, and everything. When it became clear that the 2 weeks to stop the spread, slow the curve, whatever the phrase was, and everything would open back up, it became clear that it was not going to happen. So we had to make other wedding plans. Now, I told you that the saints were in on it before we were. We were married on July 2nd, the feast of St. John, and we didn't even realize it. We didn't plan it that way. We didn't realize it until after it happened. But it really didn't catch anyone in heaven by surprise. It really didn't. July 2nd was our fallback, but they already knew. So one could say that St. John showed up to be the real Kumbaro, the best man at our wedding. Before his death, he wrote to his flock something that encapsulates this whole class. He said, "Tell everyone, even though I have reposed, I am still alive." A bishop who served in my California, and the saint that Polina was sent to for intercessions. Now, the one I was sent to, St. Xenia of St. Petersburg. She was the wife of a colonel. She was a chanter at St. Andrew Cathedral. She was widowed young. My confessor at the time, who told me to pray for her, he didn't know that my father was in the military. And he didn't know that my father died on active duty, leaving behind my mom as a widow. He did not know that I would find comfort in praying to the widow of a military man for those reasons too. He only knew that she would be a faithful intercessor for me in pursuing marriage. And he gave me the perfect prayer partner. You see, she gave everything away, everything. She even gave away her own name. And for the rest of her life, she answered only to her husband's name. She said, Andre was alive. Xenia had died. 45 years wandering Petersburg in his military coat. She's what the church calls a fool for Christ, someone who doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but nonetheless embodies that radical self-giving witness to Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:27 says, God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. A dear friend of mine who dabbles in iconography made me the sweetest gift when she painted an icon of Saint Xenia for me. Here is all of me, the icon said. When I received the icon, I wept. I had been so lonely, and I was not sure that I would ever find a wife. But I did find a friend in Saint Xenia. She was glorified by local churches in 1978, 1988. Her feast is January 24th. But guys, I have to stop for a second because there's another happy providence here. Our daughter Sasha was born on Xenia's feast day. And in case it was lost in the shuffle here, St. John showed up for our wedding, and St. Xenia showed up for our daughter's birth. These intercessors were not just given to us to get us hitched. They are friends for life. Indeed, God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. So as we round the bend and start heading toward the finish line, we have a few more saints to cover. There's Holy Apollinaria. She's a very, very popular saint in some circles. She was a desert ascetic. Her feast is January 4th or 5th, depending on which church you're in, which is an interesting thing. They often are not on back-to-back days. She was a 5th century monastic. Her father had been very high up. He was the top of the Roman world. She came for money. We'll just put it that way. She talked her way into a pilgrimage. She gave away jewels and money in Jerusalem. And at some point, she slipped away from her attendants and servants near Alexandria. And she entered a monastery as the monk Dorotheus. She was received by St. Macarius. She was falsely accused by her own sister. She even took the blame. She went home, and then she forgave and healed her sister, then went back to her cell. Her identity as a woman was only revealed at death. Her troparion says, "The image of God was truly preserved in you, O Mother, for you took up your cross and followed Christ. By so doing, you taught us to disregard the flesh, for it passes away, but to care instead for the soul, since it is immortal. Therefore, O Holy Mother Apollinaria, your spirit rejoices with the angels." Our next two saints are Saints Alexandra and Sophia. We chose these for our daughter Sasha this year. Alexandra was known as Alexandra Fedorovna. Sorry, I always mispronounce something in one of these recordings. She was known as Alex of Hesse, and she was born into a Lutheran family. She converted to Orthodox Christianity, and she was married to Tsar Nicholas II. She was the last empress of Russia. She took St. Alexandra the Martyr Empress as her own patron. She had no idea that she herself would follow her patron in martyrdom. Her name day was April 23rd, and I think it's worth pointing out that Sasha's patron saint had a patron saint, Alexandra the Martyr. In the chaplain's diary from 1917, under house arrest records, it says that they observed her name day. And despite her suffering under house arrest as an empress being held captive, she nonetheless wore her festival dress on her name day. She ate prospera, and she smiled throughout the day despite the difficulties. She was murdered with her family on July 17th, 1918. She had a quiet, unbroken faith, and she showed what it means to hold fast to Christ when everything else gets stripped away. And because we just had a hard time choosing which saint, both names of our child got associated with a saint. And the next was Sophia of Shamordino. She was Sophia Bolotova, spiritual daughter of St. Ambrose of Optina. She was married, later widowed, and then eventually tonsured a nun in 1884. She was the first abbess of Shamordino. They took in widows, orphans, the poor, the sick, the blind. She only led it for 3 years, and she died at age 42. After her death, St. Ambrose said, "Remember, Mother Sophia was a saint." He also called her a priceless soul. And of course, St. Sophia of Shamordino, she had a patron saint as well. St. Sophia the Martyr is a beloved saint of the church who was forced to witness the martyrdom of her own daughters, and who herself died of grief a few days later. Her daughters, as I mentioned earlier, were named Faith, Hope, and Love. And this precious family is beloved by the Orthodox, so it's not surprising that my mother-in-law, named after Hope, as I mentioned earlier, and Hope's mother is St. Sophia, who is the namesake of St. Sophia of Shamordino. You see, we're part of a heavenly family in the Orthodox Church, and we are intimately networked through our saints and through each other. And so back to my own daughter's patron saints, we have an emperor and a village abbess. They were both chosen for the same infant, and now my daughter has some shoes to grow into. And finally, a saint that was both chosen and given, in a sense. I want to also tell you guys about the concept of a slava. Now, this is more of a Serbian thing. Holy Benedict of Nursia is, loosely speaking, my family's slava. Let me explain. Benedict lived around 480 to 547. He was the abbot of a monastery and the author of the Benedictine rule. Benedictus means blessed. My surname, Bennett, comes from Benedictus. So, in other words, I had Benedict's name in my name in the mail before I had a choice, before I had a vote. In the Serbian tradition, they have an annual feast for the household's own patron saint. In other words, everybody shares a family saint, and they have a big feast as a family once a year. We loosely adopted this as our own. Benedict is our family saint. So he was chosen, once for the name on our mail, and secondly for the great saint behind it. Rule 1 of the prologue in the Rule of St. Benedict says, "Listen carefully, my son, to the master's instruction." You see, it was written for beginners in the monastic way, and there's room for the weak. A house with a 4-year-old and an infant certainly qualifies. Ora et labora, pray and work. It's a later summary. It's not a line from the rule, but it still governs how we seek to live our lives. So we talked about Psalm 82. Psalm 82 sat everybody down in a council. Hebrews 12 sat holy men on the council's panel. And Revelation seats elders on the thrones. We have angels, we have saints, we have God. The room was always mixed company. Venerating the saints means that we notice where we stand and then we choose who we stand with. Every liturgy, the curtain goes thin between heaven and earth. We are in the room with them, not thinking about them, with them. Every baptism, a name is chosen and a household gains a new member of the family. So today I have shared with you 9 names, one family, and there was a reason behind every one. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." Third time tonight. So back to the beginning, 2 icons facing each other, looking at one another, a community of saints. An Arizona church with 2 icons on opposite walls over where one family sat every Sunday. A California bishop and a St. Petersburg fool for Christ facing each other while Polina prayed to one and I prayed to the other, 3 time zones apart, each given the task by a wise confessor who knew what he was doing. 9 names chosen in a council you can join on purpose. The saints are among us, and they're rooting for us to join them as holy too. If you have enjoyed this message, please scan the QR code on your video, and you can sign up for more like this at simplyorthodox.info. This is a production of St. Mark Greek Orthodox Church from Boca Raton, Florida. Thank you for joining us today.